So that's a big story. How did you uncover that U.S. taxpayer dollars are being used to secretly fund a network designed to silence critics of pesticides?
That's a big question, isn't it? It's a big story. So I worked with a team of journalists, international journalists. The team was mainly led by Lighthouse Reports. We have to mention them, based in the Netherlands. And this was a collaborative effort from journalists in Africa and throughout Europe. We had people in France. I was sort of the U.S. anchor for this story. And we used Freedom of Information documents. We got government records, government contract, financing records. This was, many, many, many months of investigative reporting. And what we found was, really alarming that taxpayer dollars, that we all pay in to the government, were going to this company in Missouri and other companies that they were working with to develop sort of this shadow network that was designed to harass and intimidate, critics of industrial agriculture, people who are trying to promote agroecology or organic, people who are concerned about genetically modified crops. This was a very deep, dark sort of web of individuals and tactics designed to suppress, information about the harm of industrial agriculture. So, again, using taxpayer dollars for some of it. And we put it out there, and they didn't like it.
At which agency was funding it? Can you share?
So we have money going from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, a lot of ties between USDA and these shadowy players, and also USAID, which works for international development, and contracts through USAID. Developed $400,000 is what we saw at the very least. There was another contract for close to $5 million, although when the Trump administration transitioned to Biden, it looks like that contract was stopped in its tracks.
And what was it was Vfluence or is that the?
Vfluence, it's a weird name, right? So they're based in Missouri. It was started by a guy named Jay Byrne, who used to work at Monsanto. I'm sure a lot of your, listeners and viewers know that name, right? Monsanto. Started by Jay Byrne. He used to run PR for Monsanto. He used to work as a consultant and do work for the U.S. government. And he started this company. They describe themselves as intelligence gathering, intelligence monitoring, reputation management. They consult with and do work for both the U.S. government, obviously, but also big agrochemical companies like Monsanto and Syngenta and other people. And what we saw is this work really spans the globe. And so you saw that they were very active in trying to quash the farm to fork strategy in Europe, which was, again, to try to promote healthier agricultural practices. They wanted to kill that, quash that.
Whoa.
You see them working in Kenya and other countries throughout Africa and throughout, different countries around the world. To try to shut down anytime anybody wants to regulate pesticides, shut down, ban any sort of pesticide, or get rid of maybe GMO crops. You see these people working through this network, and maybe we should talk about that, this secret network that they set up to try to counter it. And they do it in such a way that the average person is not supposed to know they're doing it.
It's like in the shadows.
Kind of in the shadows, we had a specific example of a conference that was going to happen in Africa to talk about better practices for agriculture. And you see them going into action to basically get funding pulled for that conference.
Wow.
So
that's really unsettling. So when it's been described as a social network, what does that look like? Is it like a message board? Is it like some kind of social, like a literal social network platform on the dark web?
Yeah, that's how they refer to it, as a social network where all of these members, people from the U.S. government, people from other governments around the world, can be inside this club, if you will, with officials from Syngenta or other, big companies or certain academics where their institutions are getting money from agrochemical company interests. Anybody who is sort of a fan and ally of industrial agriculture can be a member and be part of this, and they can be in there and they can have their private chats and they can talk about tactical, strategies that they want to employ to shut down critics. And as part of this, you can't just Google it and get to it. You have to have a specific, URL, and then you have to have a specific sign-on, and there's a lot of layers of security to get inside there. But they also have, and this is part of what the government funded, files like dossiers on people that they deem as targets, people that they say are critics or get in their way or threaten the profits of agrochemical companies. And they have 500 or so people that they've targeted in these profiles. And so they provide this to their members. And, there's all sorts of information in there about, where somebody lives, what's their home address, what's their cell phone number, what are the names of their children, where do their children live if they're grown, the domain and all the information for their websites, if these people have websites. They go back, they have a speeding ticket or, things like this for people that are 30 years old, and a lot of false allegations about these people, that they're working in concert with Russian, operations to try to, thwart, the food supply or something like that.
Like anything that could be used to discredit these critics.
Anything that can be used to harass, intimidate, yeah.
And Michael Pollan was among those
Michael's
named.
in there, yeah. Michael Pollan is in there. A lot of big names that people, might associate with, authors or public speakers. I haven't checked if you're in there.
Yeah, I'm wondering.
I should have checked before I came here today.
Wow. And yeah. Are the members of this social network, are they getting paid?
I don't think we didn't see any evidence of that because, they already have their own jobs. Like you have 30 some USDA employees who we found are members, right? So they work for the USDA, but they're interacting in this secret network and being fed this information about, all of these people that they might see out doing public speaking. And then they say, oh, but we can look them up in this public network and we can see they're really not authentic, or we shouldn't trust them because they have Russian ties or something like that. It's a way to try to, as you said, try to color someone's perception of people, but also to be used if people want to try to shut them down. And we see a lot of communications between the USDA and this Jay Byrne and some of Jay Byrne's associates. There's another group called the White House Writers Group that's involved in all of this. You see that they are, I found this a little bit alarming, but maybe other people already would assume this happens. You have this outside group, the White House Writers Group, who's basically telling some of our public officials what to say on these issues, writing talking points for them, writing speeches for them. Here's what you need to say about industrial agriculture and how great it is and how it's going to feed the world and how people shouldn't worry about pesticides and chemicals and how we need to shut down, moves to try to limit, toxins in our water supply, that sort of thing. And our government is paying these groups effectively to work against the public interest and work on behalf of these, for-profit companies that are selling chemicals and polluting the air and the water and our food and our bodies. And, it just seemed alarming.
It's scary.
Yeah.
This clandestine network of, pro-ag, pro-chemical, advocates that to shut down dissent, which is part of how science progresses, right? Is dissent and conversation around these topics. Were there any social media influencers that were involved in that?
Again, I would have to go back and look.
Because it's often when you talk about, the potential benefits of organic, the potential harms of being exposed to these kinds of pesticides. You get a lot of vitriol today, particularly on social media, like the average consumer. And you hear stories all the time. There have been a number of exposés published recently by the Washington Post, among others, showing how, these multinational ultra-processed food companies are essentially paying credentialed dietitians, not all of them, but some of them certainly, and medical doctors to come out and, promote chemicals like aspartame, to, promote ideology around food that isn't necessarily productive to chronic disease prevention, that all foods fit and the like. So you do see this sort of revolving door of the food industry and their collusion with social media influencers, because that's essentially how you influence public opinion today.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's why I'm curious if there were any.
So if you're
influencers.
asking, so I would refer to them as trolls sometimes. I've certainly
1000%.
had my share of trolls. People who stalk, they're on Twitter, they're on Instagram, they're on every social media platform. And anytime anybody puts out a story or puts out a tweet about, we should look at this organic, how great organic is over here or something, bam, they're on them and they're slamming them, and they've got all of these talking points and studies that they will link to. And yeah, those people, a lot of people are members of this network. If you're talking about social media influencers like yourself or, Michael Pollan or that sort of thing, again, I'd have to look in there. They would be targets. I doubt if they would be members. But we do see a number of the people who are actively out there kind of spewing falsehoods and lies and trolling people are members of this for sure.
Yeah, I see it every day.
Yeah. And, they share information, they share tactics, they say, who are we going to go after now? And, it's very well orchestrated,
It's scary, particularly in light of the widespread fraud that you see, in science. I mean, Retraction Watch recently published a blog where speculating based on data, but this is preprint information, so it hasn't been, peer-reviewed or published yet, but essentially that at least 1 in 7 scientific papers have some degree of fraud in them. So it's like this systemic web of corruption and fraud and influence and corporate interest.
I mean, we didn't really look at that in this story, but, I've been covering this industry as a journalist now for 20, 30 years, and certainly have seen a lot of that, which is shocking, where you have editors of journals, of scientific journals that are supposed to be sort of a gold standard, and you see them being paid consulting fees from companies that are submitting, scientific studies for them to publish. And, we had one editor we found was getting $400 an hour as a consultant for a chemical company, and publishing studies that the chemical company wanted him to study, and not publishing studies the chemical company didn't want it to, rejecting those kind of studies. So, yeah, I mean, there is so much corruption and in this area of science, and it relates to not only kind of areas that I specialize in, which are pesticides, agrochemicals, that kind of thing, but yeah, just in the general food space, right? I mean, we saw things with Coca-Cola and Pepsi when I was covering that a few years ago, and how they're in bed with the CDC, scientists at CDC on public health issues, and when they're trying to figure out, should we regulate, sugary sodas, and what does that mean for diabetes and obesity, and really weighing in to control the messaging that is coming from our public health officials to the consumer. And how would the consumer know that the information they're getting is being corrupted?
Yeah, your average consumer has no idea that, for example, in 2020, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans Committee, 95% of those committee members had ties to the food industry or the pharmaceutical industry. I believe it's gotten somewhat better in the 2025 committee. It's about 50% is the last estimate that I've seen. But yeah, there's this continual collusion and muddying of the truth, which I think is, does real harm. But what do you say to somebody who's listening to this, maybe a cynic who just thinks, I mean, these are conspiracy theories?
Well, except they're not. I mean, because we have the emails, we have actual emails, we have communications, we have communications where they say, we don't want anybody to know that we're doing this. We don't want this to be public. We want this to be secret. And I think it depends on how you look at it. if you're fine, if you think it's, every man for himself, every consumer for himself, and companies have every right to try to push, their products and sell them at any cost, and the consumer, beware. I mean, maybe that's fair. I sort of think that it's unethical and evil to hide information, intentionally hide information about the risks that of a product that you're selling to consumers. But, we do have regulatory agencies that are supposed to be the check and the balance before products get out to marketplace. Unfortunately, many of those have been corrupted. And again, the only way you can convince people is sometimes to show them with their own eyes. And, we try to do that as a journalist and other journalists I work with. We try to put the actual freedom of information documents that we get or other, information online where people can see it. There are several different places where people can go. We could talk about that at some point, but, repositories of documents where people can go. And whole books have been written about these things, right? I mean, it's not in doubt. There's no question of the very rampant collusion that goes on between U.S. federal agencies and the companies that they're supposed to regulate.
It's scary. And you and I first connected. I first became aware of your work when you did this incredible article exposing the connection between paraquat, which is an herbicide that is produced in China. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's banned for use in China, but they export it. Syngenta, this company, exports it. We use it here. And it is very clearly linked with Parkinson's disease, and even causally. I mean, they use it in animal models to create Parkinson's symptoms. This company has known for decades that it's able to enter the brain, that it accumulates in the brain, that's a mitochondrial poison. But they've essentially, thanks to your work, we now know that they essentially created like a SWAT team, right, to suppress this information. It's terrifying.
Yeah, that's what they called it, was a SWAT team, right? But yeah, no, this was incredible. This is a company, Syngenta. They're actually based in Switzerland, but yeah, they're owned by the Chinese government essentially now. A lot of the paraquat is actually produced in the UK, manufactured there, that they sell. They have a product called Gramoxone that farmers around the world have been using since like the 60s. But I was able to get my hands on, 5,000 pages or so of internal Syngenta documents that date back to like the late 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And you see that this company was well aware decades ago that this stuff was getting into the brain, and that chronic exposure, not acute exposure can kill you. Like paraquat is so deadly that if you accidentally ingest, I think it's a teaspoon, a half a teaspoon, you're pretty much dead in 3 weeks. Like it just tears your body to shreds. Wow. But this was chronic exposure over a long time. If you're wearing protective gear, but maybe somehow you're inhaling a little bit, or somehow you're getting some through the protective gear on your skin a little bit over time, it can transfer into the brain and destroy essentially the dopamine producing neurons in the brain, in a particular part of the brain, that leads to what you see in a Parkinson's patient, right? They lose basically the messaging system between their brain and their body, and they lose their ability to function. And it's an awful, terrible disease that, as you know, is really on the rise and affecting so many people. But
it's the fastest growing brain disease.
Yeah, it's terrible. But what we see, and it's called the farmer's disease because so many farmers have it, but in these documents, we were able to see that they knew long ago that it crosses a blood-brain barrier, that it gets in, that their own scientific studies, their own scientists was finding that it was killing the dopamine-producing neurons in the brain that cause Parkinson's, and then they hid those studies. They didn't turn them over to the EPA. They suppressed those studies. They wanted to work to suppress all the other studies that independent scientists were doing, formed a SWAT team, hired V-Fluence. When we get back to the circle, of V-Fluence.
Wow.
And now they're being sued by 5,000-6,000 people in the U.S. and several hundred people in Canada who have Parkinson's, claiming that their exposure to paraquat caused their disease. And they're essentially just saying, you should have warned us. Like, you should have told us what you knew instead of working to try to hide it from us. Just let us know, and then we can decide, right, if we want to use it or not.
That's a form of lying. I mean, it's lying by omission.
Yeah. So, and you actually have members of Congress now who are calling on the EPA. They sent a letter earlier in October. 47 members, I think, of the House sent a letter to the EPA saying, you have to ban this. Like, this is ridiculous. You have to ban this. The Senate, same thing, calling on the EPA to ban it. California's been trying to pass a measure to ban it. How many other countries? 60, 70 other countries around the world have banned it, including China, as you said. So, but the U.S. is like, we're just going to keep on letting them sell it and use it. And
that's crazy. And I mean, the idea that this is just like a thin slice. I mean, this is just like one tiny portion of the rug that you were able to lift up,
right.
And see all the corruption underneath. But it's like, it's a microcosm.
Yeah.
I mean, it like
it's
represents.
Just an example. It's representative, right, of the bigger issue. And
wow.
There's so many other examples, right? There's so many other companies and so many. You can see it in tobacco. You can see it in pharmaceutical. You can see it, in the food and the drink. You certainly see it in agriculture. Saw it with Monsanto, right? I'm sure a lot of people have heard about Monsanto and Roundup and hiding all of the science related to cancer and how it causes non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and even ghost writing scientific studies where Monsanto actually said, we're going to ghost write, so these studies will look like they came from independent scientists, but we're actually going to write them. I mean, it's part of the way they do business, it's just.
Wow. And was your investigation into paraquat and Syngenta, is that where you first heard about V-fluence?
No, I mean, I think I'd known about V-fluence. I didn't know about this whole social network till we really started digging in. But V-fluences, they've been around for a while. But, I think I would know them because I'd been covering Monsanto and knew Jay Byrne at Monsanto and that sort of thing.
Wow.
So.
Yeah, walk us through your background. You've got a really interesting story and you do such important work. But yeah, I mean, how long have you been covering this?
A long time.
The agricultural industry.
Yeah, 1998.
Wow.
So I was living in Atlanta, covering the banking industry. I thought the banking industry was the most important. I was covering the biggest banks in the country, and I thought there's no more important industry. And then Reuters, international news agency, said, we're going to move you to Kansas and have you write about agriculture. And I was like, oh my God, that's horrible, right? That's a horrible idea. But moved to Kansas, put on my blue jeans and my boots and went out in the field and climbed on tractors and combines and got to know farmers and just really became part of that world. And covering Monsanto and Syngenta and Dow and DuPont and all these companies that control agriculture essentially around the world and have revolutionized how we grow our food. And it's very different than how we used to grow our food. And just learned all of that, got to know scientists and agronomists and became part of that world and was welcomed into Monsanto and their headquarters many, many times, got to know a lot of people there. But over the years, as I learned more and wrote more and became, I started seeing the environmental impacts of heavy use of some of these chemicals and how that wasn't necessarily the greatest thing for soil health and biodiversity and scientific studies showing impacts on human health. I learned about it. I wrote about it. Reuters has, millions and millions of readers around the world. It's one of the biggest news outlets in the world. And so the agrochemical industry started not being really happy with me and started coming for me. And some of those trolls, right, started coming out of the woodwork. And I got invited less and less to Monsanto headquarters. And it moved to a place where they actively were trying to get me fired. And they did not hide that. And we have documents where they talk about that. And then I wrote my first book, which was basically an expose on all of that we were talking about here and the corruption in the industry and the hiding of scientific evidence of harm and that sort of thing. And then we could go on and on. They developed a Carey Gillam book plan that we got our hands on that was, here's how we're going to destroy our reputation and destroy the book and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was sort of the playbook for what they do to anybody who they think gets in their way. And you just keep doing what you're doing. I write now a lot for The Guardian. I'm managing editor for a news outlet called The New Lead and just continuing to publish and work on these issues because I think they're important and I got kids. So
Wow. Yeah, it reminds me of Rachel Carson in Silent Spring and the pushback and the vitriol that she experienced. But that book was revolutionary. I mean, it got DDT banned, correctly?
Exactly.
Correct? Yeah. It's like, it reminds me of that Margaret Mead quote, never doubt that the world could be changed by a group of a small group of individuals.
Right.
It's the only
thing that ever has, or
it's
something
the only
like
thing that ever has. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just so important to get this out there.
Yeah.
So as a mom, then how do you reconcile everything that all the sort of dirty secrets of agriculture, modern agriculture, when it comes to what you're buying and feeding your family with?
Oh yeah. Well, it was a battle when they were younger, right? Because they want the unhealthy food, right? They want the chips and the snacks and all that kind of thing, and but you want them to have the healthy stuff. So my biggest thing, I guess, has been like the fresh food, like the strawberries. My kids want strawberries every single morning. So we really want to have organic strawberries. We want to have organic blueberries. I want the fresh whole food that I feed them to be as healthy as possible. So we try to buy organic. For a long time, we had milk delivered to the house from a farm, down the street, and they would deliver this fresh, milk to us that was created by cows that didn't eat GMOs and that sort of thing. But, I just tried, like any mom. I mean, you try to just do your best. My work as a journalist, is what I hope for other moms, that if you have the information, then you make the decisions that are best for you. But I'm not ever going to be somebody who says you have to do this, right? Because I think everybody has their own decision-making tree. How much money does this cost? What do I need to do here? I don't know. Organic strawberries now. Geez, I just bought them the other day and they were like $10 almost, in the store just for a little quart of them. And it's crazy, but we all make our own choices, and it's important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly there's a cohort of these trolls, as you described, that are nefarious in intention and, seek out critics and promoters of organic foods and the like. But there are also, I think, a lot of really well-intentioned, experts on social media, whether dietitians or nutrition, experts or advocates with various backgrounds who, look at the data and will, come to their own conclusions that based on the available data, there doesn't seem to be evidence that organic is better for you, that it leads to better health outcomes. So what do you say to those people who are perhaps, open-minded enough to be receptive to the message that you're delivering?
I haven't, there aren't a lot of studies, number one, right, about that. There are a few, there are some, but there aren't any. And essentially, how would you do that? So how do you do that? Do you put people into, cages and you feed them only, for 2 years, you do a study of, we can't really study the impacts in humans. And I'm not a scientist, but I certainly talk to a lot of them, and we're all exposed to so many different things. And trying to follow people and follow them on an organic diet and then follow other people for long periods of time. I have seen studies that are done, and, I think they have differing results, but you also then have all these other factors at play, right? So what are your confounding factors that you've got to weigh in there? What are their genetics, right? And where do they live? And what are the other pollutants that they might be being exposed to regardless of diet? So I think it's a very hard thing to say that. But certainly logically, if you're going to say, do you want to eat food that contains insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, or do you want to eat food that is free from all of those things? Logically, what would you prefer to have? And then you can make a decision on that. And, the government, it's not in doubt that the food that is not organically grown is laden with chemicals, toxic chemicals. The U.S. government, the USDA, and the FDA every year put out annual reports, and they're very thick books. And anybody can look at them online, or you can get them sent to your home. And you can see the foods that are tested, and you can see what are the pesticides that the government has found in these foods. And every year for as long as I've been doing this, the majority of the foods that the government tests every year contain pesticide residues. And then they list them, and they list the prevalence. This most recent year, the top one was a neurotoxin insecticide that has been banned in Europe, but it's the top pesticide found in the food that our government tests. So I don't know, do you want to keep consuming that or do you not? The other thing to keep in mind is, our government, again, will say, yeah, you got a lot of pesticides in your food, but they're at levels that are fine. They're low enough that they're not going to hurt you over time, so don't worry about it. But routinely, the U.S. government will raise those levels if the companies selling the pesticides go to them and say, hey, we want to sell this for a new use, so we need you to raise what that safe level is. And we have evidence that the government has done that. And our levels in the U.S. of what we consider safe are much higher than what you see in Europe. They similarly have safe levels, but they're much lower. So why is that? Why is it that an apple is considered safe in the U.S. if it has X amount of this particular type of pesticide, but in Europe, that same apple and that same pesticide would be considered unsafe at that level?
I so appreciate their approach, like the precautionary principle.
Precautionary principle, yeah. We don't do that in the U.S. In the U.S., we want you to prove that it's unsafe, and then we'll think about taking it off the market. In Europe, they want to prove it's safe. I mean, there was a great example this week, as we're sitting here talking in mid-October, the end of October. The EPA finally announced that it was banning this particular weed killer that has been used for years and years and years, because they know that it poses a risk to unborn babies, like a very dire risk. So if pregnant women are exposed to this in a farm field, or it's used on golf courses or athletic fields, they know that the unborn babies can suffer, dire consequences in terms of birth defects and neurodevelopmental harm. And the EPA has known this for decades. Decades. But it's taken them this long to go, yeah, okay, we're going to finally ban this. Because they talked about it, and then they wanted to restrict it, and then they talked to the company, and then they wanted more studies, and this went on and on and on for years. So it's great that they just now finally banned this one chemical that they know harms unborn babies. But it took decades to do it. And the last time that they banned a chemical like this was 40 years ago. So they're not a fast actor on science that shows harm.
Wow. What's the pesticide? Do we know?
It's called Dactyl. It's not one that people would be familiar with, but
wow.
Dacthal.
Oh my God, so scary.
We're here to scare people.
No, we're not. We're here to empower people.
Yeah.
But there have been just so many instances like this where a product, a compound has been unleashed into the American population only decades later to be realized is actually quite poisonous,
right.
And everybody I think is familiar with the partially hydrogenated oils, the trans fats that we were told was the healthier alternative
right.
to saturated fats that are naturally contained in some of our most nutrient dense whole foods. And we now know that there's essentially no safe level of trans fat consumption. They're poisonous to the cardiovascular system, to the brain. Is it true that the safety data that the FDA looks at comes from the industry?
Oh yeah, and the EPA as well. I mean, the scientific studies that are relied on and used for regulatory approvals, the vast majority do come from the companies that want to sell the product. And, in a way, so it seems crazy. Because,
it's not objective.
Because it's not objective in any way, shape, or form. But it makes sense to a degree, because who else is going to do it? Because these studies cost a lot of money, right? There's a lot of time and investment involved in it. And so who else is going to do it? A lot of, advocates for a different system say we could have the companies pay into, right, a system, and then that could fund independent science. And we should be doing that and have more of a reliance on people that don't have, money at stake on this really. But we don't have that system right now. So, here's an example from long ago, but, with Monsanto and the glyphosate Roundup that people are aware of, in the 80s, they even submitted a study to the EPA, and the EPA said, well, your study shows that the animals, it was mice or rats, I can't remember now, are getting tumors, rare tumors. So this looks like this causes cancer. So we don't like this. This will be classified as possibly causing cancer. And Monsanto came to them and said, no, you're not looking at the data right. Let us tell you how to look at the data, this kind of thing. And basically, you can see through all of the records over those years, worked on the EPA for many months, and the EPA finally said, okay, you're right. We'll change our analysis and side with you and not our own scientists. And the EPA scientists at that time refused to sign off on that, but it still went into effect. And so that approval of that chemical, glyphosate, dates back that far, but it hinged on a very first study that showed a link to cancer. And it showed Monsanto basically telling the government how to interpret that data so that they would say it didn't cause cancer. And that happens over and over and over and over again.
And we know that science is like hierarchical and cumulative, and so like all the other subsequent studies that have built on that one study, I mean, how much can you trust those? It's like very similar in the world of Alzheimer's disease, where you see rampant fraud. Like really high level, highly regarded researchers who just churning out these papers that, I mean, most recently there was an NIH-funded researcher who was first author on hundreds of papers, Parkinson's related, Alzheimer's related papers, and it was discovered that the allegations are that they were all essentially fraudulent, and it's like those papers have been cited subsequently since their publication by hundreds of other papers, thousands potentially of other papers.
Yeah, you put it out there and it lives in the world. I mean, this is what they want to do, right? You put that out there and it informs people and changes. I mean, what we've seen, they even work on children, right? I mean, elementary school children, high school, there's programs that these companies have to indoctrinate children. And they go to scholastic, publishers for lesson planning and things like that. And they have materials for kids at all ages that essentially indoctrinates them into whatever the message is.
Get them young.
Yeah, get them young. Don't worry about these processed foods. Don't worry about this. Don't worry about that.
Wow. Does the EU use the same data to assess safety, and they just look at it with greater scrutiny, or do they use a different data set? Like, how do they determine safety?
If it's the same companies, they would be submitting a lot of the same studies. There are different, like, global, and I'm speaking, my area of expertise is just this the agrochemical industry. But they have a group called ECHA, they have EFSA, European Food Safety Agency, I think the word is agency. And they look at data, but they do have a more independent kind of, they take a deeper look at independent findings. And you see much less willingness to just accept what the companies are saying over in Europe. And you have the European Parliament, which is very sort of progressive, and there are different elements within that, different parties, but very progressive and very protective of public health and the environment. And I think that is pervasive throughout European culture. You sort of see that throughout, that there's a greater connectedness, I think, to sort of the importance of history and the land and the purity of the food and the water. And I don't know why that is necessarily an older, culture. Here we just seem to rape and pillage.
Well, it's a revolving door. I don't know if that is, how similar that is in the EU. I have no idea. But here, I mean, it's like you have, heads over at the FDA who, are at the FDA one year, the next year they're working for these, agri companies, and vice versa.
Yeah. or pharma, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yeah.
It's not a big deal. It's just kind of the way it works.
Should be illegal.
It seems like it should be illegal. I mean, we saw, with one of these companies that I was writing about, this guy's getting ready to retire, from the EPA, and they're like, he's a friend of ours, we can use him over here, but let's get him to put out this report before he leaves that is favorable to us, and you see the communications again, back and forth. This guy is great, and we even have text messages. Got him in our pocket, and he puts out the report, then he leaves the EPA, and then he goes and gets a cushy job for the chemical industry. It happens over and over and over and over again.
Wow. What about, because there are certain herbicides and pesticides that are approved for use in organic systems, right?
They don't use synthetic. There are a lot of synthetic chemicals are banned. But if you have things that are sort of naturally occurring that are effective at suppressing weeds or effective at suppressing insects and things like that, a lot of those are allowed, yeah. But, I mean, you would have to look at the national organic standards. And there are battles back and forth over what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed and what the impacts are. But, even if you're trying to be completely free in your organic farming, completely free of any synthetic chemical whatsoever, you still can sometimes get residues of that through the water or through animal waste, that you might be applying as fertilizer or something like that. Because, our own government, our Department of Interior finds a lot of these chemicals in rainfall. So it's pretty hard to mitigate against rain coming down from the sky onto your fields.
Well, if money is an issue, as it is for so many people, how do you prioritize what to buy organic versus what not to buy?
How do you prioritize that? I know, right?
Yeah.
How do you? I don't know. Eggs, milk, fruits, vegetables. To me, that's what you should be eating anyway, right? You shouldn't be eating things that come from a box necessarily, right? Or processed. So, but I think those fresher foods would be the foods that would carry the higher residues anyway than processed. If you're feeding foods to children, babies, you're going to prioritize that, right? We found evidence of a lot of baby foods. If you look in the government reports, you'll see a lot of, the applesauces or the actual baby foods or baby oatmeal contain a lot of pesticides. Maybe you don't want to be feeding that to your baby whose brain is, just kicking in and getting developing. So, I think you just have to prioritize where you are in the world. Right. Yeah. So how many synthetic toxins do you want to be throwing into your kid? Not very many.
Yeah, because it's like, the reality is, even if your diet is fully organic, which I don't think it needs, my stance is I don't think it needs to be fully organic, but, you're still being exposed. Every day to innumerable industrial toxicants.
Right. In the air, in the water you breathe.
So it's just like...
in the clothes you wear.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, you ought to, go a step further and do a little bit of due diligence to at least reduce your overall burden, your exposome, which I think is so important. But when it comes to foods like, bananas or avocados where you take off a peel, are those concerning to you, or do you think those are fine to consume?
Less so, I think. But, we did just have a story not too long ago about a scientific study looking at apples. It looked at a lot of different fresh foods, but the point was apples that they detected how far the pesticide goes into past the skin, and they were like, peeling your apples not necessarily going to help you. Washing it's definitely not going to help you.
Washing it doesn't help.
Washing is not going to help. No, because pesticides permeate the skin and they get into the meat of the fruit that you're eating or the vegetable that you're eating. But the deeper you go, they found the less pesticide. So if you take off the skin, you take off maybe a good hunk of the
skin is where all the benefits are, though.
That's what I always thought, right? That's when I was growing up. My mom was like, "You gotta eat your apple skin." And
the pulp is just like, or the flesh is just like fiber and sugar and probably some minerals, but the skin, you get all the, all those natural, naturally generated insecticides created by the plant.
Yeah. But, if you're buying conventional and you know that these have been sprayed, and they wouldn't have been sprayed probably just once, but over and over, and it's embedded itself into the food that you're eating, you might want to peel them.
And what about, it always shocks me when I think about, and you hear reports about grains, and the pesticide residues in products like oatmeal and wheat, because these chemicals aren't being used purely or merely as insecticides and herbicides. And with those crops, they're being used to dry them out pre-harvest, to make them easier to harvest. Are they not?
Yeah. Desiccation is what they call it. Yeah. Spray it on wheat, as you said, lentils, oats. And so it's a reason why you would see a lot of it in oatmeal, for instance. But yeah, they do it in the more sort of northern areas where you have a cooler, wetter kind of conditions in the spring. If you're getting ready to harvest and you want to dry out your crops and you want to even out your harvest schedule, they'll do this. And so when you're spraying this on the mature grains, right before you harvest and bring it in, and then you process it, yeah, you do find it. I wrote about, it was North Dakota, I believe it was, in spring wheat, and you had an academic up there and he wanted to test finished flour products and to see how much of this particular pesticide was in them. And he found it in every single flour product he looked at. He thought that maybe through that whole process of turning it from grain into flour, it would eliminate the residue, but it didn't.
Wow.
So, yeah, and you find it in oatmeal all over the place.
Yeah, oatmeal.
Honey, organic honey. I got these EPA documents once. FDA. I'm sorry. Or was it? No, yeah, it was FDA. An FDA chemist, and he was testing organic honey that was sold. He just went out to stores around the country and had them all shipped in and then tested, and found these pesticides in these organic honey that were being sold to people, and went and reported it to his superiors and said, this, first of all, would be illegal because we're not allowed to use these. They're not supposed to be in honey. And they basically just told him, don't even, we're not going to.
Wow.
We're not going to make a lot of noise about this. We're not going to talk to anybody about this. And yeah. And then, of course, I wrote about it, and then the honey companies got sued, which was very sad and terrible. And but yeah, it's hard to get away from.
Well, and how do the pesticides get in there? It's like being trafficked in by the bees,
right?
Is my assumption, right?
Of course, yeah. The bees are going out where bees go and pick up pollen and pick up things, and they get the pesticides, and it's in your honey.
Wow.
Can't escape.
Well, we don't want to leave people afraid of consuming fruits and vegetables. So what advice do you have for my listeners?
Move to Europe. No, I'm kidding.
I don't, I certainly, I buy, I'll tell you how do you do how I approach this. I buy, if it's something that I'm eating all the time, and if it's something where I'm eating the skin or the flesh or the whole leaf, that's when I will, prioritize organic. So like organic berries, organic dark leafy greens. Right. I eat a fair amount of dark leafy greens, so I buy what I bring into my house, I make sure that it's organic. I don't buy organic avocados. I don't buy organic bananas. I buy organic apples.
Yeah.
Because I'm eating the skin. And then I don't really worry about it so much when I'm out and about. If I'm traveling, if I'm,
right.
out of pocket for a week, I still want to make sure that I'm getting my dark leafy greens.
Right.
If I am at a cafe and I'm having breakfast and it comes with a little fruit salad with some berries on it, I eat them. I'm not.
You're not
going
to ask where it came from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But health is determined by your dietary pattern, as a whole, as opposed to these like acute exposures. So I try to make sure that what I'm bringing into my home is, I follow the 80-20 or 90-10 rule. But when I'm out, I tend not to worry about it. Is that what you say? That's a reasonable approach?
I think so. I think that's exactly what I was trying to convey earlier, but not as organized as you did. That, you make a priority, your own personal priority list. And what do I consume a lot? What do I want to be sure that, it's as pesticide free as possible? And but you'd make yourself crazy. I I have a friend who, everything, the sheets, the pillows, the candles, the soaps, the shampoos, like everything you touch, everything you consume, everything must be organic at all times. Fantastic. But there's no way that most people could. There's no way that I could do that, right? There's no way.
Well, the thing is, so much. Like, you've seen behind the curtain,
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're coming, for anybody who's like concerned that this is a, that this is like a scary topic to cover. I mean, it's like you really have been in the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
And so it's adorned you with a certain perspective that I think is really important, but also we don't want people to avoid foods that are by and large healthy.
Right. Yeah. No. And again, my work and sort of my perspective is not to try to tell people what to eat or what not to eat, or say,
that's my job.
Let's be afraid. Right. That's you. Let's be afraid. All industrial agriculture is bad, but there is a deceitfulness, a duplicity, an active, organized effort to keep consumers from knowing the truth about their food. And it is true. It is not a conspiracy theorist. Myself and many other journalists and others have documented this for many years in books and research, and we have data behind it. And that is wrong. And that should not be the way our system works. And if consumers know about it, they can perhaps demand that their lawmakers do something about it, or vote with their pocketbook when they make purchases. I think that people need to know, and then they make their own decisions. And it's bigger than chemicals in food. It's, it has to do with, we don't have time probably to go, concentrated animal feeding operations, the big hog, poultry, and cattle operations that are just destroying the landscape and polluting our waterways and causing, harm to the animals. And we all don't need to eat, as much meat as we consume. We don't need to destroy the planet. We don't need to contribute all of that, CO2 and the methane from all of these animals. So there's a lot to think about to be a responsible citizen, I think, in the world that goes deeper than just your own health, perhaps.
Yeah.
But that's certainly where it starts. And so I think what you're doing is great, encouraging people to be smarter and think about what they're consuming, and I applaud you. And
thank you. Likewise.
I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, we promote. I mean, I definitely, I take a protein forward approach, but there's no need to support the factory farm system. I mean, I think that's awful. These regenerative systems, what do you think about those? These smaller farms.
Trying to work in concert with nature and use the animals and use the pasture and use the natural fertilizers and the grains then to feed the animals, this sort of whole integrated system makes a lot more sense than what we're doing with these big concentrated animal feeding operations, where these animals are just being fed, GMO corn over and over, and they're standing in their own waste, and they're defecating, and then their waste is being washed into the water, and it's full of chemicals, and then the water is getting into the drink. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So
no, it's a big problem. I mean, but there's a cost with, I think, steering people away, even for as bad as those systems are. What is the potential downside, the potential risk of steering people away from lean protein, even if it comes from that system,
right,
is that they're going to consume more maybe conventionally grown produce. And some might say that that's a good thing. That's a net positive. I don't know if I necessarily agree, but because you got to eat something.
That's what I was going to say. You have to have a balance. You have to have your protein,
yeah,
wherever you get it from. And I am a fan of lean protein and poultry and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But again, we are not being very smart about the way that we produce our food.
Correct.
In this modern society, and we should be smarter.
Do you have any cost-saving tips for people who want to begin to bring more organic produce into the home?
Good Lord. Find a local farmer, find a local farmer's market, right? I don't know. I live in Kansas. Maybe it's a lot easier for me than other people, but that is kind of my favorite thing to do, right? Is to seek out these farmers markets and and really get to know your farmer and get to know, like I talked about this dairy earlier, they have eggs and milk and cheese and yogurts and things like that. And you just feel good when you feel better, I think, when you know where it's coming from and how it's being produced, if that's possible, if you have that opportunity.
Totally. Do you have any advice for listeners and viewers to help support how one might support your efforts to, expose these kinds of
nonprofit journalism? We don't get this from for-profit. We don't get this from the big TV stations and the New York Times, sometimes to a degree, but you're seeing most of the best investigative journalism now coming from nonprofit news, because
independent media as well, right?
Yeah,
but like the Lead, right? Your
the new
publication,
Lead.
the new Lead.
We're a nonprofit. The New Lead. You have the Guardian. You have Investigate Midwest. You have all of these ProPublica. The Intercept. All of these different groups that are being funded by foundations, by individuals. It's a way for you to support independent investigative journalism, is to go to these nonprofits, and we're not beholden to the big wealthy corporations, like outlets that rely on advertisers would be, for instance. So yeah, you can support the New Lead, thenewlead.org, LEDE. But yeah, I'm a big fan of journalism, obviously, of shining a light and just trying to educate people, and then they use that information as they will, obviously.
Yeah.
Or don't.
Yeah. Well, but as long as the information's out there, it allows people to make informed decisions.
Right. That's what everybody's aiming for, I think. Right. And then you have your whole network of activists and advocacy groups that use the information as well. But I think consumers should work their hardest to learn about what they're eating, for sure, where it comes from, what it could do to their bodies, how it's grown, and again, what you're feeding your kids, because this is our next generation, and our next, and our next, and our next, and we're a pretty sick society, as you've talked about. I mean, cancers are on the rise, many types of cancers, many types of childhood cancers. We have neurodevelopmental diseases. We have, these diseases that are affecting people later in life, like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, and increasing rates of dementia in many populations. We're getting sicker.
Yeah.
And we should do something about it. We should be smarter.
Yeah, and why anybody would want to leave the health of their family, of their loved ones, in the hands of these big agrochemical producers, to me is just bewildering, no matter what the data says. I mean, we know how corrupt it can be,
Yeah.
and ultimately, if you were ever to get sick, God forbid, first of all, good luck proving what caused your illness, right?
Right.
But then going up against these corporations that have infinitely more money than you do, good freaking luck.
These people, well, and you've seen what they're trying to do is they're trying to make it so you can't even sue them. They've been trying to get laws passed in Washington, D.C. and different state level actions that would cut off the courts as an avenue for people who are injured by these chemicals or other sorts of things that they would be, they demonize the lawyers, the plaintiffs' lawyers, who bring cases to trial for people. And it's really the only way you have, really, as a citizen, right, to try to get back something if you've been injured or lost a child or developed cancer or, something like that. So it's not an easy system for
so
the
they're
consumer.
trying to make it illegal to sue them?
Mm-hmm. Pretty much. Yeah. They're trying to add a measure to the Farm Bill right now in D.C., and they've been trying to get it passed in many different states around the country. To basically cut them off at the knees, cut off these court cases.
Damn. Well, it's a big shame. I'm so glad that we have an advocate and somebody such as yourself, such a rigorous investigator, out on the front lines doing this kind of work. Because, I mean, if not you, who?
You, back at you.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Takes a village.
Yeah.
I think it takes a village. All of us. In your book, my books, people talking about these podcasts, things like that. Just sharing the information.
Yeah, so important.
Yeah.
Share the information, guys. Well, thank you so much, Carey, for coming out. And yeah, just remind listeners, I've got one last question for you, but remind listeners where they can, how they can support your work, where they can read your articles.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah. So I write a lot for The Guardian, but I manage the New Lead, LEDE, thenewlead.org, which is a little nonprofit. Would love the support. I've got a Substack called Unspun, where I put out a lot of the deeper, darker, juicy details that maybe don't always make it into a story. And and The Guardian, and you can see CareyGillam.com, my own website, which occasionally is hacked.
It's hacked occasionally.
It's occasionally hacked. You can also, if you Google Carey Gillam, you will probably also get a lot of really interesting information saying that I am a Russian spy and that, all sorts of other things. There's a lot of hate Carey Gillam out there too. But,
oh no. I get it too, though. You know, there's no shame in the game.
No, it's like I think it means you're making a difference.
It does. It means that you're making a difference. If you want zero criticism, do nothing, say nothing, be nothing.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, it's the only way to progress is to step outside of the orthodoxy, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I so appreciate your work, and also your book. Remind us the name of your book.
First book is called Whitewash. This was an investigative book exposing the corruption in the agrochemical industry. Won 3 awards, including the Rachel Carson Book Award.
Wow!
And it's been republished and translated in multiple languages. So, highly recommend that book. Second book is the Monsanto Papers, which is billed more as like a John Grisham legal thriller, and is just taking readers on this wild kind of court case, this wild ride of the first court case to go up against Monsanto.
Wow.
It's going to be made, not my book, but I mean the story is going to be made into a movie.
So cool.
Laura Dern is signed up for the movie. So
whoa.
Anyway, yeah.
That's exciting.
Both of them. I encourage both of them.
Love it. Last question that I guess ask everybody on the show. What does living a genius life mean to you?
Oh my gosh. Coming on this podcast, right?
Maybe.
Trying to work the hardest I can, not ever take no for an answer, be smart, be engaged, and try to share what I learned with the rest of the world. That's my genius life.
Hell yeah. Love it.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.